started with a break. That's all I wanted. Just a break. A week off work. Away from the noise of the city. Away from the screens and people and mess. I booked a cabin way up north, deep into the woods of Michigan. It was old, a little run down, but the pictures showed a quiet clearing surrounded by trees and a small lake not too far from it. It looked perfect. Isolated, quiet, simple. It didn't need to be fancy. It just needed to be far. I packed light. Just food for the week, a water filter, some basic tools, and clothes. I brought a battery-powered lantern, a few flashlights, a knife, and an old revolver my grandfather left me. I didn't even know if the gun worked, but I figured it wouldn't hurt to bring it. You never know with the woods. The drive up took most of the day. Once I left the main highway, the roads got narrower and rougher. Potholes, sharp turns, stretches where I didn't see another car for what felt like hours. My phone lost signal about 30 minutes before I got there. That was the last ping of the outside world. I didn't really think much about it. That was kind of the point. The cabin looked like the photos, just more worn. The wood was faded gray, the porch sagged a little, and one of the steps had a crack right down the middle. Still, it stood. The roof looked solid, and the door opened without much trouble. Inside smelled like dust and pine. There was a single bedroom, a small kitchen with an old stove, a wood-burning heater, and a narrow bathroom with a toilet that had to be flushed with water from a bucket. There was no plumbing, no electricity, just a rain barrel out back, a well pump about 20 feet away, and a big stone fireplace in the main room. First night was quiet. I made some food on the small gas burner I brought, set up my sleeping bag on the old bed, and read by lantern light until I was tired. The woods outside creaked and groaned, branches tapping against the walls and roof. I heard something heavy move through the trees once, but I figured it was a deer or maybe a bear. I wasn't worried. Next morning, I walked around the area. There wasn't much out there. The trail in was barely a trail, more like a break in the brush. I found the lake maybe a quarter mile away, clear and still. I sat there for an hour, watching dragonflies skim across the surface. It was peaceful. For a while, it felt like exactly what I needed. But things started to feel off by the second night. I was sitting outside after dark, watching the stars. No light pollution out there, so the sky looked like it was crawling with stars. I'd brought a small folding chair and was sipping from a flask when I heard something move just at the edge of the tree line. Not the soft movement of wind or a small animal. Something deliberate, slow, like footsteps through leaves. I turned off my lantern and listened. It stopped. I waited maybe 10 minutes before going inside. I locked the door, not that a wooden latch would stop much, and made sure the shutters were closed. That night, I barely slept. Every time I started to drift, I'd hear something shift outside. A knock, a scrape, a distant crunch. I kept telling myself it was wildlife, just normal woods sounds, but it didn't feel that way. Next day, I found boot prints behind the cabin. Not mine. I checked. These were larger, deeper. The soil was soft from a light rain that morning, and there were at least 2 sets, both heading toward the back door, neither heading away. I stood there staring at them for a long time. I felt exposed, watched. I kept scanning the trees, expecting someone to step out, but nothing did. Eventually, I went inside and kept the revolver nearby for the rest of the day. I didn't go out again. I ate cold food, didn't light the lantern, and stayed low, just listening. Around midnight, I heard tapping on the front wall. Not fast, not loud, just soft taps, spaced out like someone testing the wood. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe hard. I just sat there, revolver in my hand, back against the wall, eyes on the door. The tapping stopped after a while. I stayed awake until morning. First light, I packed. I didn't care about finishing the week. I was done. I threw everything into the bag, grabbed the keys, and stepped outside. The morning was foggy, low mist hanging just above the ground. As I walked to my truck, I noticed something nailed into one of the trees near the trail, a small square of wood. I hadn't seen it before. I walked closer. It was a board with a piece of meat nailed to it, rotting, maggots crawling through it. Underneath, scratched into the bark of the tree, were the words, "Stay inside." I turned and ran to the truck. The door was open. I hadn't left it that way. Everything inside was torn apart. Glove box open, seats slashed, my maps shredded. I didn't see anyone around. No movement, just silence and fog. I climbed in anyway and tried the ignition. Nothing. The battery was dead. Or pulled. I opened the hood. Wires were gone. I stood there, frozen. No way to call out. No way to drive. Nearest town was at least 20 miles down bad roads. I could try walking, but with whoever or whatever was out there, that felt like suicide. I went back to the cabin. I stayed low that day, trying to come up with a plan. I had a few cans of food left, maybe a gallon of filtered water. I figured if I waited until dark, I could try walking out. Use the moonlight, stay off the trail. I spent hours going over the map in my head. The way I came, the turns, the hills. I thought I could make it. That night, I left just after sunset. I wore dark clothes, kept the revolver in one hand and a small flashlight in the other, only using it when I had to. The woods were thick. Branches grabbed at me, thorns ripped at my sleeves. I kept hearing things behind me, snaps, breathing, low footsteps that stopped when I stopped. After maybe an hour, I saw a light ahead. I froze. It wasn't the town, too close. It was a fire, small, controlled. I crept closer. There was a man standing by it, alone, dirty clothes, beard down to his chest, holding something in his hands. I couldn't tell what it was. He didn't move like he was cold or cooking. He just stood there, staring into the fire, like he was waiting. I backed away and turned east. I kept walking faster now. The forest got steeper, rougher. I slid down one hill and tore a gash in my leg on a sharp rock. Blood soaked my sock. I had to stop and wrap it. I used part of my shirt. Around 3 in the morning, I found a road. Gravel, narrow, but a road. I followed it. About 30 minutes later, I saw headlights. I stepped into the middle of the road and waved both arms. The truck stopped. A man got out, rifle slung over his shoulder. He looked me up and down, then asked if I needed help. I nodded. He didn't ask questions, just let me in and drove. He dropped me at the sheriff's office in the nearest town. I told them everything, showed them the cuts, the footprints I'd photographed on my phone before I lost signal, even the marks on the trees. They sent 2 deputies up there the next day. They found the cabin, found my gear, found the board with the meat, but nothing else.
No prints, no wires.
No man, just an empty clearing. I never went back. I never found out who was out there, but someone was. They'd been watching, waiting, and they didn't want me to leave. I sold the truck, moved back to the city, and I haven't set foot in the woods since. Not once, not even for a hike, because every time I see trees, I remember that meat on the board, that carved warning, those sounds at night, and I know somewhere out there they're still watching, and this time they might not let the next person walk away. I'd rented the cabin for a week. It was up in the woods about 25 miles off a quiet state road in northern Minnesota. The listing was plain, no Wi-Fi, no cell signal, no neighbors for miles. That was the whole appeal. I'd been working in IT for almost 10 years, and after burning out hard over a messy project, I needed something to reset. The idea of sitting out on a wooden deck with a thermos of black coffee and no notifications to deal with sounded perfect. I'd driven up early on a Monday morning, stopping once in a little town called Birch Hollow to grab groceries. There was nothing fancy about the place, just a grocery store, a gas station, and a bar with a hand-painted sign. From there, the road turned to gravel, then dirt. By the time I reached the cabin, my car was coated in dust and my tires had kicked up more rocks than I cared to count. The cabin was simple, a single story with a wraparound porch, faded red paint on the exterior, and a metal chimney poking up from the center. Inside it was cleaner than I expected. Wood stove, kitchenette, small bedroom, a bathroom with a compost toilet. There was a generator in a shed out back and a small pile of split firewood. I settled in fast, unloaded the car, made a sandwich, cracked open a beer, and sat out on the porch until the sun started dropping. That first night was calm. I built a fire in the stove and read until I got tired. The woods were completely silent. Not even wind in the trees. Just that kind of thick quiet you only really get deep in the woods. I slept straight through until morning. I spent the next 2 days hiking, cooking, sitting on the porch. I didn't see a single person. A couple squirrels, some deer out near the treeline, and one black bear far off in a valley. Nothing close, nothing unusual. It was exactly what I'd wanted, solitude. But things started to shift on Thursday. It started when I noticed tracks behind the cabin. Not boot tracks, barefoot, but large. Too large to be normal. At first, I thought maybe someone had come through, maybe even the owner checking up on the place. But there were no tire tracks and no sign of anyone coming or going on the narrow path leading in. I tried not to think about it. Just animal tracks, maybe, or some trick of the mud. That night, I left the generator off and used only the fire. Around midnight, I woke up to a sound I couldn't place. It wasn't loud, just different. A kind of soft shuffling, like something dragging across dry pine needles. I sat up in bed and held still. The fire was still burning low in the stove, casting dim light against the walls. I waited a long time, listening. Then I heard it again, closer this time. Still soft, still deliberate. I got out of bed and looked through the window above the kitchen sink. The forest was black beyond the tree line, and the moon wasn't out. I couldn't see anything, but something was out there. I felt it. The next morning, I checked the ground around the cabin again. More of the same tracks. They circled the whole building now. A few of them came right up to the windows. They were deep in the soft dirt, heel to toe, like someone or something had been standing there for a while. That day, I stayed close. I kept the axe I found in the woodshed next to me the whole time. I didn't hike. I didn't read. I just sat, listened, and watched the woods. Late that afternoon, I spotted movement between the trees. It was fast, just a flicker, but I saw something tall, two-legged. It ducked behind a tree before I could get a clear look. That's when I stopped trying to rationalize it. Something was out there, watching me. I locked the door that night. I shoved the dresser against it and kept the axe within reach. I didn't sleep much. Around 2 a.m., I heard a low creaking outside the bedroom window, then a heavy thump. Not like footsteps, more like something heavy dropping to the ground. I didn't look. I just sat in the dark and waited. By morning, I was shaking. I packed my things fast and loaded them into the car. I didn't even bother to clean up. I just wanted out, but the car wouldn't start. I tried the key 4 times before I popped the hood and saw that the battery cables had been pulled clean off. Not chewed, pulled. Like someone had grabbed them with bare hands and yanked until they tore loose. That stopped me cold. I backed away and went into the cabin. I locked the door again, sat down on the floor, and waited. I knew I couldn't walk out, not with 25 miles of woods and no signal. I'd seen no one in days. If I left, I might not make it. So I waited. The next 2 days were hell. I kept the fire going and rationed what food I had left. I drank from the jugs of water I'd brought in the car. Every night, I heard it moving outside. Sometimes it would scrape along the walls. Once, it banged on the door so hard the hinges rattled. On the 3rd day, I spotted it fully. It stood maybe 20 feet away from the porch, just on the edge of the woods. Tall, thin, covered in short dark hair. It had long arms, longer than its legs, and its head looked too small for its body. It didn't move when I saw it, just stood there, watching me. I didn't move either. Eventually, it backed away into the trees. I didn't see it again after that. But that night, I heard it circling again. Always slow, always quiet. The next morning, I decided to leave. I didn't care how far it was. I packed what I could carry, took the axe, and left the rest behind. I walked fast, heart pounding the whole way. The path out was narrow, overgrown in places. I kept turning around, expecting it to be there. It never showed. I made it to the gravel road by sundown. By luck or something else, a truck came by not long after. The guy didn't ask questions, just drove me back to Birch Hollow. I told the sheriff someone had tampered with my car, but I didn't say anything else. I don't think he would have believed me. I haven't gone back to the woods since. I don't even camp anymore. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't some ghost or myth. It was real. It was smart. And I don't think it wanted me dead. It wanted me gone. And it got what it wanted. It started with a week off work. I'd saved up vacation days for over a year, figuring I'd use them all at once. The plan was to get out of the city, get away from the constant noise, and finally breathe for a bit. I rented a cabin up north, close to a lake, tucked deep into the woods. The photos online made it look perfect, quiet, secluded, and surrounded by trees. The drive there was long. The roads got thinner the further north I went, until they were more like wide trails than anything meant for cars. By the time I arrived, it was late afternoon, the sun dipping low behind the trees. The cabin was exactly as pictured. It sat alone, no neighbors in sight, just miles of woods stretching out in every direction. I spent the first 2 days relaxing. I fished a little in the mornings, hiked a few of the nearby trails in the afternoons, and spent the evenings reading or sitting by the fire pit. It was exactly what I'd hoped for: calm, uneventful, and far removed from anything I was used to. But things started to shift by the third day. It began with small things. I noticed the trash bin outside had been knocked over during the night. I figured it was a raccoon or something. I cleaned it up and didn't think twice. Then I saw deep scratches on the side of the cabin, long and uneven, down by the base, like something had dragged claws across the wood. I bent down to inspect them and could fit 3 fingers inside one of the grooves. It was too big for a raccoon, too deliberate, too strong. I tried to tell myself it was maybe a bear. I'd never seen one up close, but I knew they came through this area sometimes. Maybe it had wandered close. The next night, I woke up to the sound of movement outside. Not just movement, but heavy footsteps circling the cabin. I stayed in bed at first, not sure if I'd imagined it, but the sounds kept going. I got up and went to the window. The woods were dark, and I couldn't see anything beyond the trees. Then I saw the shape. Not clearly, just enough. It stood on 2 legs. That was the first thing that registered. 2 legs, tall and broad at the shoulders. I saw the curve of its back as it walked. Then it paused near the trees, turned slightly, and disappeared into the dark. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I stayed inside, all the lights on, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it. Maybe I was tired. Maybe it had been a tree trunk moving in the wind, or my own reflection. But the next morning I saw more tracks. They weren't shaped like human footprints, not quite. They were longer, more stretched out, and the toes were off, longer, with space between them, like paws but wrong. I followed them a little into the tree line, but stopped about 10 feet in. The hairs on my arms were standing straight up. From that point on, things got worse. Every night I'd hear it, walking, circling, sometimes breathing against the wall of the cabin. I kept all the doors locked and the windows shut, but that didn't stop the sound of it scraping the wood. Once I thought I saw its face, just for a second, through the narrow slit in the curtains. It looked like a dog, but stretched, with wide-set eyes and a snout that seemed longer than it should be. I started to carry the hatchet with me inside the cabin. I didn't leave during the evenings anymore. I barely stepped outside at all. One night, just after midnight, I heard something hit the back wall. Not like a scratch, more like a body. I grabbed the hatchet and stepped into the main room. Then came the sound of the door handle moving. Not violently, slowly, like someone testing it. I stood frozen. The door was locked. The handle moved again. Then silence. I waited for what felt like an hour. I didn't move. Finally, I crept back to the window and peeked through a gap. Nothing. The next morning, I found what looked like blood on the wood near the door. A smear like something had rubbed up against it while bleeding. I don't know if it was from the thing or something it had killed, but it was fresh. I decided to leave. I didn't care that I'd only stayed 5 days out of the 7. I packed quickly, loaded everything into the car, and didn't even stop to double check if I'd forgotten anything. Driving back down that narrow road, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see it running after me. I didn't breathe easy until I hit paved roads again. When I got home, I tried to look it up. I didn't want to. I didn't want to feed into whatever fear was still stuck in my chest. But I couldn't help it. I searched for sightings, stories, anything about something that walked on two legs, tall, shaped like a dog but not quite. That's when I started seeing the word dogman. It sounded ridiculous at first, but the descriptions matched. People had seen something like it in woods, near cabins, usually late at night. Always alone, always watching. I haven't gone back into the woods since. I won't. Whatever that thing was, it was real. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a monster from a story. It was something alive, something out there, and I think it was just as curious about me as I was terrified of it. But what scared me the most wasn't that it came close or that it scratched the cabin or even that it tried the door. What scared me most was that it never rushed. It was patient, knew I was there. It watched me, and it never left any sign of panic or fear. It was just waiting for something. I'm glad I left when I did. If I'd stayed another night, maybe I would have found out what it was waiting for. I don't want to know. I booked the cabin after weeks of looking for something isolated, deep in the woods, without Wi-Fi or cell service. I needed to be away from people, not for a vacation, but because I was overwhelmed by my job, my phone, everything. I needed quiet, real quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. I picked a cabin in a forested part of northern Minnesota. The listing didn't say much, just a couple of pictures showing a small wooden cabin surrounded by tall trees, a short gravel drive, and an outhouse behind it. No running water, no electricity, just a wood stove and a cot. That's what I wanted. Nothing extra. The drive took over 9 hours from where I lived. The last hour of that was on dirt roads that narrowed so much I worried they wouldn't be passable in spots. The air got colder as I drove. Pine trees closed in from both sides. I kept checking the directions I had written down since there was no service. I finally reached a small pull-off just as the sun started dipping low behind the trees. There was a metal gate, unlocked, and a narrow path beyond it that a vehicle could drive on. I opened the gate, drove in, and closed it behind me. I followed the track through the woods for another few minutes until it opened to a small clearing, and the cabin sat there, just like in the photos. Tiny, dark wood, one step up to the porch. No signs of life. I shut the engine off and listened. The silence was real. Not a car, not a voice, just wind moving gently through branches. The smell was a mix of pine needles, damp earth, and that subtle mustiness that only the deep woods have. I unloaded the few things I brought. A sleeping bag, a backpack with food, a small cooler, a camp stove, matches, a flashlight, and an axe. There was a pile of firewood beside the cabin. Inside was bare bones, a cot with a thin pad, a small wood stove, a single shelf with a couple pots, and an old lantern. That was it. I lit a small fire, unrolled my bag, and sat on the porch as the sun finished setting. It got cold fast. I had brought a coat and gloves, knowing the nights could dip below freezing. The first night went fine. I heard some rustling outside once, maybe a raccoon or something larger, but it didn't come close. I kept the axe next to me, more for peace of mind than anything. The next morning, I woke up stiff but rested. I heated up some oatmeal and boiled coffee on the camp stove. There was no agenda. I had no one to answer to. I planned to hike a little, read, maybe chop some wood. I had brought a small journal and a paperback. I walked a little way past the outhouse and into the woods. There wasn't a trail, just deer paths and open forest. I followed one for maybe half a mile, marked a tree with my knife, and looped back. On the way back, I noticed something odd. A tree near the clearing, tall and thin, maybe a birch, had a series of small notches carved into it. Horizontal lines, stacked one after another going up about 4 feet. Not deep, but fresh. They hadn't been there when I arrived. I was sure of that. I would have noticed. Maybe someone came through, a hunter, but I hadn't heard a car. The gate was still closed and locked. I told myself I was probably wrong. Maybe I just didn't notice. That night, I kept the fire going longer. I stayed inside after dark and read. Around 11 p.m., I heard what sounded like a single knock, not on the door, but on the side of the cabin. It was quiet, deliberate. I stood completely still. I didn't even breathe for a second. The knock didn't come again. I reached for the flashlight and the axe. I waited, listening. Silence returned. After maybe 15 minutes, I stepped outside and shined the flashlight around the clearing. Nothing. No prints I could see. Just my own boots from earlier. No animals. No movement. Just trees and cold air. I went back inside, locked the door, and stayed up late. I fell asleep close to dawn. The third day was overcast. It never really got bright out. I kept busy chopping wood, but I kept glancing at the tree with the notches. They looked the same, but now I saw a second tree nearby with a single notch in it. I told myself again it was nothing. Probably some old marking. Maybe animals. It didn't make sense, but I didn't want to dwell. That night, it knocked again. Twice. One knock, a pause, then another. Then silence. I froze in my bag. I kept the axe under the covers with me. The fire burned low, but I didn't want to move to stoke it. I stared at the door until the sun rose. On the fourth day, I checked around again. This time, I noticed footprints behind the outhouse. Human. Definitely not mine. My boots were big, heavy treads. These were smoother, smaller. They came up to the back of the outhouse and then walked away into the woods. I followed them until they faded into dead leaves. I didn't like that. I didn't like how quiet everything was now. I kept turning around, expecting to see someone. I chopped more wood. I kept the axe close. I barely ate. I just felt watched. That night, I moved the cot to the far corner of the cabin, so I could see both the door and the window. I put the lantern out and sat in the dark, clutching the axe. Nothing for hours. Then, around 3 a.m., I heard the creak of a board on the porch. Slow. Just one. Then another. Whoever it was stood there for a long time. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I just stared at the door. I had locked it. I had jammed a piece of firewood against it. Eventually, the creaking stopped. I stayed still until sunrise. When I stepped out, there were more prints. The same ones. Clear as anything. They walked around the cabin. The notched tree now had 2 more marks. The second tree had 3. I lost it. I packed everything in minutes. I didn't clean up. I didn't care. I just threw my stuff in the car, started the engine, and backed out fast. The drive out was tense. Every bend, I thought I might see someone standing in the road. I kept checking the mirror. Once I reached the main road, I kept driving. Hours. Didn't stop until I was halfway home. At a diner, I sat down and ordered coffee. I must have looked terrible. Pale eyes sunk in. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I never wrote a review. I never contacted the owner. I just wanted to forget it. But a week later, at home, I found something. On my front door, just one notch, carved carefully into the frame. Fresh. I stayed at a cabin once, out past the edge of a small lake in northern Minnesota. The kind of place you have to drive miles down a dirt road to reach, the kind of place where your cell phone drops off signal and the air smells like pine and wet moss. I had been wanting some peace and quiet for a while, something away from the noise of town and the grind of my work. The cabin belonged to an old coworker who had moved away years earlier, and he offered to let me use it for a week. Said it hadn't been used in a while, but it had everything I'd need, with stove, running water from a well pump, a propane tank for the stove and lights. When I pulled up the first day, the sun was just starting to sink low behind the trees. The driveway was overgrown but still passable, and the cabin looked about how I expected. Old logs darkened by time and weather, a metal roof rusted at the edges, a chimney made of large stones. There was an old shed in the back that looked like it had seen better days, and a small dock that jutted out onto the lake. No neighbors in sight, not even across the water. The first night passed without issue. I unpacked, lit a fire, made a simple dinner, and listened to the crickets and the frogs until I fell asleep. The quiet was good. It helped my thoughts settle. It was the second day when I noticed the dog. I was drinking coffee on the porch, staring out at the water, when I saw something move at the tree line on the far side of the clearing. It was low to the ground and dark brown, and it moved slowly, deliberately, keeping low in the grass. My first thought was coyote, but it was too big. and the shape was all wrong. When it stepped forward into the light, I saw it clearly. A dog, some kind of mutt with shaggy fur and long legs. Its head hung low, and it had a strange, almost limping gait, like it was favoring one leg. I don't know why, but I felt uneasy right away. The dog didn't act like a lost pet or a stray looking for food. It didn't bark or whine or wag its tail. It just stood there for a long time at the edge of the trees, staring at me. Eventually, it turned and disappeared back into the woods. I tried to shake the feeling, told myself it was just a stray or a feral dog, maybe even a wolf that looked off in the light. I spent the rest of the day chopping some wood, walking a trail behind the cabin, and trying to relax. That night, I locked the door and shuttered the windows before bed. I had started to feel a little on edge, and I didn't like how quiet everything seemed. No owls, no frogs like the night before, just stillness. Around midnight, I woke up to a soft sound on the porch. It was quiet, like something brushing against the wood. I laid still in bed for a while, listening. Then I heard the boards creak slowly, one by one. I knew that sound. It was the sound of something walking up and down the length of the porch. I didn't get up. I didn't even move. I just stared at the ceiling, heart beating in my ears. The next morning, I found claw marks on the wood outside the door. They weren't huge, but they were deep and fresh. Too wide for a raccoon. Too long for any normal dog I've ever seen. I thought about leaving then. I even packed up some of my things and started the truck. But something kept me there. Maybe it was pride. Maybe I didn't want to tell people I'd run off scared because of a stray dog. I told myself I'd give it one more night. That afternoon, I walked the perimeter of the cabin, looking for tracks or signs. I found a trail through the trees that led down toward the lake. The ground was soft from recent rain, and I saw prints there. Dog prints, but the spacing was strange. Wide apart like it had a long stride, and deeper on one side, as if it was dragging one leg. Back at the cabin, I kept the axe close. I cooked with the door locked. I moved one of the chairs to face the window that looked out over the clearing, just so I could keep an eye on things. Came back that night. This time I saw it through the window. It stood right at the edge of the trees again, same spot as before, just standing there staring. I didn't turn on any lights. I just sat in the dark, watching it. After what felt like an hour, it moved again, not toward the cabin but around, toward the back. I lost sight of it. I didn't sleep. I sat up all night, listening. At some point, just before dawn, I must have drifted off. When I opened my eyes again, the light was creeping in through the cracks in the shutters. I opened the door slowly and stepped out onto the porch. Dead rabbit. That's what I found. Laid right in the center of the porch. Gutted, cleanly. Not torn up, not eaten. Just opened and left there like some kind of offering or warning. I stepped back inside and threw the bolt on the door. I didn't even make coffee that morning. I packed everything. I loaded the truck. I made sure the axe was within arm's reach. I got ready to go. When I turned the key, the engine didn't turn over. Not even a click. I popped the hood and checked everything I could think of. Battery cables were in place. No signs of corrosion, but the battery was dead. Completely. It had worked the day before. I hadn't left any lights on. No signal. No working truck. No way to leave. That day passed like a fog. I stayed inside mostly, except to gather more firewood and water from the well. I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the trees. I started to hear things too. Snapping twigs, light footsteps, just at the edge of hearing. By the time night came, I had moved the mattress in front of the door and stacked furniture against the windows. I kept the axe in my lap. I sat in the corner of the cabin and waited. I heard it walking again, this time not on the porch, but around the sides of the cabin. Slow, dragging steps. The boards creaked as it stepped up onto the porch again. Then silence. Hours passed. My eyes grew heavy. I fought sleep, but eventually it took me. In the morning, I found the side of the shed had been torn open. Not the door, one whole wall. Something had clawed through the wood, splintering it apart. Inside, the few tools that had been stored there were scattered. One of the rakes was broken in half. I decided I had to hike out. I packed a bag with water, some food, the axe. I locked the cabin as best I could and started down the road. The woods were quiet, too quiet. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. I kept moving. Every few minutes, I'd stop and listen. I could hear my own heartbeat. A mile down the road, I heard something behind me. I turned and saw nothing. I kept walking, heard it again. A stick breaking, leaves rustling. I picked up the pace. At one point, I broke into a jog, then a run. I didn't stop until I hit the main road. A truck passed not long after. I flagged it down. The man gave me a ride to the nearest town. I didn't say much. I told him my truck died. Left it at that. I came back weeks later with a tow truck. The cabin was just as I left it, but the porch had fresh scratches. Deep ones. Longer. More of them. I haven't been back since. I still don't know what it was. Some wild dog, maybe injured and territorial. Or something feral. Something that had once been domesticated but had lived too long alone in the woods. But it wasn't just the dog itself that scared me. It was the way it watched, the way it moved, the way it seemed to know exactly where I was and what I was doing. I think it was waiting, watching to see how long I would last, testing the edges of the place, wearing me down. I think if I had stayed one more night, I wouldn't have made it out. That's why I haven't gone back. That's why I never will. I don't know what made me choose that cabin. I had scrolled past dozens online, looking for something cheap and far from people, and the one I picked wasn't even the nicest. It was plain, maybe even a little ugly. Dark wood siding, metal roof, and it sat low in a patch of trees about an hour from the nearest town. But it was cheap, available for the whole week, and the photos showed it had what I needed. A bed, a wood stove, and silence. I booked it for 7 days. The goal was to get away completely. I had too much noise in my life. City noise, work noise, even when things were quiet, my head never was. I figured a week alone in the woods would fix that. The drive out was fine. Long but fine. The roads got narrow and winding the deeper I went, and the trees got thick. The sky was gray the whole way. It felt like I was driving into a different time, or maybe a dream. Once I passed the last gas station, I didn't see another car. No houses either, just woods. The road to the cabin wasn't really a road. More like 2 tracks carved through leaves and mud. The trees pressed in on both sides. I took it slow and scraped the underside of my car once or twice, but eventually the woods opened up into a small clearing, and there it was, just like the pictures, even plainer in person. I got out and stretched. Everything smelled like damp pine and cold dirt. The cabin was smaller than it looked online, but not in a bad way. It had a porch with a single chair, a window on either side of the door, and a stovepipe rising from the back corner. Inside was cold and dark. I opened the curtains and lit the propane lanterns. The place was clean, sort of. Not dirty, just dusty, like no one had stayed there in a while. The kitchen was just a counter and a pump sink that didn't work. There was a small table with 2 chairs, a shelf with canned food, and a wood stove with a stack of logs beside it. The bed was against the far wall. Thin mattress, but it looked fine. I unpacked, lit a fire, and sat on the porch until it got dark. The silence was real. Not just the absence of sound, but that heavy kind of silence that feels like a blanket. No cars, no talking, no machines humming. Just wind in the trees. It was exactly what I wanted. The first night was normal. I cooked a can of soup on the stove and read by lantern light. I slept okay. A few times I woke up, but only because the fire had burned down and it was cold. I threw on more logs and went back to sleep. The second day I walked the area. There was a narrow trail behind the cabin that led into the woods. It didn't look like a hiking trail, just a path that had been used a few times. I followed it for maybe half a mile, then turned back. I didn't want to get lost. That night, I was brushing my teeth outside with a bottle of water when I heard a sound in the trees. It wasn't loud, just a soft crunch, like a footstep on leaves. I froze and stared into the woods. Nothing moved. I listened for a long time, then another crunch. Closer this time. It was probably an animal, a deer or something, but I couldn't see anything, and the trees were thick. I stood there for a while before I turned and went inside. I locked the door and made sure the fire was strong. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept hearing small noises, not loud enough to pinpoint, but enough to keep me awake. Scratching, maybe, or soft taps. I told myself it was the trees or the stove creaking. The next morning, I walked around the cabin. The ground was muddy from frost melting, and I saw tracks. Not shoe prints, but small round ones. Animal tracks. I didn't know what kind, but they led up to the porch, then disappeared. Maybe raccoons, maybe something else. Day 3 was colder. The sky stayed gray, and the wind picked up. I stayed inside most of the day, reading and watching the woods from the windows. The trees looked different now. Taller, maybe, or thinner. It was subtle, but I noticed. I wondered if I was just bored. That night, the noises got worse. I heard something knock. Once. Just once. Like a single knuckle against the wood outside. It was around 2 or 3 a.m. I sat up in bed and held still. My heart was pounding. Nothing followed. No more knocks.
No footsteps.
Just that one sound. The next morning, I found new tracks. Not animal. Human. They were faint, but I saw them. Boots smaller than mine. They circled the cabin once, then stopped near the back window. Then gone. I stood there for a long time. My car was still there, untouched. The door was still locked, but someone had been out there. I hadn't heard them. I hadn't seen anything, but they had walked right up to the window while I was sleeping. I thought about leaving. I even started packing, but I had this stubborn idea in my head that I was overreacting, that maybe they were old prints. Maybe the last guest walked around, but they looked fresh. They hadn't been rained on, and the ground was still damp from frost. I stayed, but I started carrying the axe inside. That night, I didn't light a fire. I didn't want the smoke to show. I sat in the dark with the lantern off and listened. Around midnight, I heard the back steps creak. It was unmistakable. One slow creak, then another. I held my breath. My hand was on the axe. Then silence. No knock this time.
No footsteps.
Nothing. I waited until morning to move. When the light came through the window, I checked outside. There were more prints. This time they led from the back steps to the front porch, then off into the trees. I followed them for maybe 20 yards before they vanished into the undergrowth. That was it. I packed everything. Fast. I didn't even eat. I threw it all in the car and started driving. The dirt road was slick, and I slid once, but I didn't stop. When I got back to town, I pulled into the first gas station and used the bathroom. I looked at myself in the mirror. I looked tired, pale. My hands were shaking. I didn't call the owner. I didn't ask for a refund. I just left a note on the booking app saying left early, all good. I don't know who was out there. Could have been a hiker. Could have been someone else. But they never knocked twice. They just circled and waited. I took a break from work last November. I hadn't planned on it, but things were piling up. Mentally, mostly. I'd been pushing through long hours, skipping meals, not really talking to anyone. I wasn't burned out in the loud way where people snap, scream at someone, quit their job and move to the desert. It was the quiet kind. The kind where you stop sleeping and nothing feels right, and you start to feel like maybe the walls are closing in even if they aren't. That kind of tired. So I looked for something cheap and quiet. I wanted to be alone, not in a fun way but in a necessary way. I just needed to not be anywhere near the city or people for a while. I remembered an old coworker mentioning he had a family cabin in upstate New York, near the Adirondacks, that they never used anymore. I still had his number. I texted him, and within a few hours he told me where the keys were and gave me a general idea of where to find the place. He warned me it was rustic, no running water, no heat unless I used the wood stove, and spotty cell service if any at all. I told him that sounded perfect. The cabin was near a dirt road off a narrow 2-lane highway. Once I got past the last town, it felt like I was driving into nowhere. No street lights, no cars, not even houses. Just endless rows of trees. Pines, mostly some bare oaks. The road was muddy and rutted from rain and frost. My tires slipped a little in spots. When I finally pulled up to the clearing, I killed the engine and just sat for a minute. The place looked like a rectangle of dark wood squatting in the trees. It had a short front porch with one railing missing and a steep metal roof coated in damp leaves. The windows were clouded over. The silence was deep and wide. No birds, no rustling, just that blank quiet that comes with cold places deep in the woods. I stepped out of the car and stretched. The air was crisp and clean, cold enough to see my breath. The ground was soft but firm, damp with old rain. It felt like the kind of place where sound didn't carry. Like even if I shouted, the trees would just swallow it whole. Inside the cabin, it was dark and smelled like old wood, wet paper, and dust. There was one room, a kind of open layout, a bed pushed against the far wall, a small kitchen area with a sink that clearly hadn't been used in a while, and a table with 2 chairs. There was a large black wood stove in one corner with a stack of chopped wood beside it. I unpacked what little I brought: canned food, a sleeping bag, bottled water, a headlamp, a hunting knife, and a thick coat, and made myself a space on the bed. I had no plans, no agenda. I just wanted to sit, walk, breathe. I left my phone off most of the time. I read, walked short loops through the woods during the day, and sat inside when it got dark. That first day was uneventful, and so was the second. Quiet, simple, and still. But by the third day, I started to notice things that didn't feel right. The first was small, a muddy footprint near the back door. I kept that door shut and locked from the inside, and I always came in through the front porch. But there it was, one partial boot print, half smudged, like someone had stepped in the mud and then scraped it on the edge of the wooden floor just inside. I stared at it for a while, unsure if maybe I'd done it myself without realizing. But my boots were dry. I hadn't been out in the mud since the day before, and I'd wiped them off outside. I told myself maybe it was old. Maybe someone had been there months ago and it never got cleaned. Still, it made me look around a little more carefully. I checked all the doors and windows. Nothing was open, and the locks were still bolted. The place had no signs of recent visitors, no cigarette butts outside, no new trash. Nothing. I let it go. I didn't want to spook myself. That night it snowed lightly, just a dusting, enough to coat the roof and ground in white. I watched it fall from the porch for a while, then went inside, lit a small fire in the stove, and went to sleep early. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to a sound, a sharp knock. I sat up fast, heart racing. The fire had burned down low. The room was mostly shadows. I sat still and listened. Nothing. I stayed like that for what felt like 10 minutes, listening so hard my ears rang. But there was no other sound. No wind, no creaking, just stillness. I finally lay back down, telling myself maybe it was snow falling from a branch. But it hadn't sounded like that. It had sounded like knuckles on wood. The next morning, I went outside and circled the cabin. My breath came out in clouds. It was cold but clear. There were no footprints in the snow. Not mine, not anyone else's. I looked for animal tracks too, but saw none. I shook it off. I've been tired. Maybe I dreamed it. Maybe it was the cabin settling. Old wood creaks in weird ways. But I kept my knife closer that day. I started locking the doors even during the day. Something felt off now. That evening, I was chopping a few logs out back when I saw something. It was just a flash of movement in the trees, maybe 100 feet away, past the edge of the clearing. It was low to the ground, dark-colored. Could have been a deer, maybe a black bear, though it moved too smoothly for either. It was only for a second before it was gone again behind the trunks. I stood there, axe in hand, staring at the trees for a long time. Nothing moved again. No sound. I went inside, latched the doors, and didn't light a fire that night. I didn't want the smoke to show. I barely slept. I kept hearing noises, small ones like twigs snapping, leaves crunching. Each time I'd sit up and wait. Each time, nothing followed. By the 5th day, I was done. I had originally planned to stay 7, but I couldn't relax anymore. I was on edge all the time. I didn't know if I was being paranoid or if something was really out there. And honestly, I didn't care anymore. I packed up before the sun came up. But when I went out to load the car, something stopped me cold. There were tracks in the snow. Human tracks. Boot prints. Not mine. They came from the woods, from the same spot I'd seen movement the day before, and circled the cabin. Twice. They stopped at the front door, the back window, and the side of the porch. Then they went back into the woods. My boots were a different size. I checked. These were smaller, and they were fresh, crisp edges in the snow, not even melted. Whoever it was had come during the night, walked around the cabin, looked in the windows. That was all I needed. I threw everything in the car, started the engine, and didn't look back. I drove nonstop until I hit the highway. I kept checking the rearview mirror the entire way out of the woods. I never found out who it was. I never saw a face, never heard a voice, but someone was out there, watching, waiting. They never tried to break in. They just walked around and watched. That's what gets me the most. The silence of it. It wasn't a robbery. Nothing was taken. It wasn't vandalism. Nothing was broken. They didn't want anything. They just wanted to be close, to stand outside while I slept, to circle the cabin, to knock once, just loud enough to wake me, and then disappear into the trees. I think about it more than I'd like. Sometimes when I'm walking at night or lying in bed, I wonder if someone's just standing outside the window, not moving, not saying anything, just watching. Since then, I don't camp anymore. I don't stay in cabins. I keep my windows locked, my blinds drawn. I bought cameras for my place even though I live in a city now. I learned something out there. Sometimes people don't want to take. They don't want to hurt. They just want to remind you they're out there. And that's enough. I rented the cabin because I needed space. Not emotional space or anything like that, just physical space. I'd been stuck in a crowded apartment building downtown for over a year, surrounded by paper-thin walls, traffic noise, and the sound of footsteps above me day and night. I work remotely, so I thought a week off the grid in a quiet part of the woods might help reset my mind. No Wi-Fi, no neighbors, just trees and silence. I found the place through an online listing. It didn't have many reviews, just a few brief ones from years ago saying it was basic but peaceful. That was enough for me. The photos showed a small log cabin in a wide clearing, surrounded by thick forest. No other structures around. The listing said the nearest road was 2 miles from the property and the parking area was a short hike in. That appealed to me even more. I drove 6 hours to get there, then parked where the gravel path ended. I hauled my gear on foot: food, water jugs, sleeping bag, solar charger, basic tools, and a few comforts like a small camping chair and a paperback book. The path was narrow and overgrown in parts, like it hadn't been used much. It took me nearly 45 minutes to get to the cabin. It looked just like the photos, old, weathered, but still solid. It had 1 door, 2 small windows, a tin roof, and a front porch just big enough to sit on. Inside was 1 room, wooden floor, small table, cast iron stove, shelves with some rusted pots and utensils, and a single bed frame with a thin mattress. No electricity, no plumbing. There was a hand pump well about 30 yards from the cabin and a small outhouse a little deeper into the woods. It was exactly what I wanted. The first 2 days went by quietly. I cooked simple meals, read, walked a few trails that spiderwebbed off from the clearing. The woods were thick and seemed to go on forever. I saw no signs of other people, not even a candy wrapper or a footprint, just squirrels, birds, and the occasional deer. I slept early, woke up early, and spent a lot of time just sitting on the porch watching the light change through the trees. On the 3rd night, things shifted. I was reading just before sunset when I heard something hit the side of the cabin. A soft thud, like a rock or stick. I froze. Then I heard it again. Another thud from the back wall. I stood up slowly and looked through the window, but it was already too dark to see much. I opened the door and stepped onto the porch. The forest looked calm. Crickets were chirping. No wind. I circled the cabin once. Nothing on the ground. No sign of anyone. I figured maybe something fell from a tree. A branch, a pine cone. I went back in, locked the door, and tried to forget about it. But the feeling lingered. Tension, like I wasn't alone. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept hearing things. Soft scrapes, the sound of something brushing against wood. once what sounded like something lightly tapping the window. I didn't get up. I lay still, eyes open in the dark, listening. My hand stayed on the handle of the hatchet I kept beside the bed. By morning, I was exhausted. I walked the perimeter again. I found footprints, bare feet, human. They circled the cabin, sometimes close enough to press toes against the wall. The prints were narrow, the toes long. They didn't look right. I tried to convince myself they were mine, maybe from when I went out in flip-flops the day I arrived. But the depth and direction didn't match. I told myself someone must be messing around. Some local kids maybe, though it was far from any town. But there were no tire tracks on the trail, no boot prints. And why barefoot? I stayed inside most of the day, only stepping out to pump more water. I made lunch but didn't finish it. My stomach was tight. I kept watching the tree line, half expecting to see someone standing there. But there was nothing, just wind in the branches and birds flying overhead. That night, I didn't sleep at all. Around midnight, I heard movement outside. This time, it wasn't subtle. It was pacing. Something or someone walking circles around the cabin, crunching twigs, brushing leaves. Once it stopped by the door. I heard breathing, slow, steady breathing right against the wood. I didn't move. I sat in the dark with the hatchet in one hand and a flashlight in the other. I didn't turn it on. I didn't want to show where I was. The breathing went on for what felt like forever, then stopped. The footsteps moved away. I stayed in that position until dawn. The next morning, I found something on the porch, a dead rabbit, gutted, with a rock pressed into its chest. I nearly threw up. It hadn't been eaten, just torn open. The way it was laid out looked deliberate. I walked to the tree line and shouted into the woods. Not words, just noise. I was shaking. I didn't care who or what was out there. I wanted it gone. I decided to leave. I packed everything, loaded my backpack, and headed down the trail. I hadn't walked 10 minutes when I saw it. A tree freshly carved. Dozens of lines in the bark, not letters, just deep, straight cuts, overlapping like a tally but with no order. At the base, there was a pile of small bones. Maybe birds, maybe not. I kept walking. Took longer to get back to the car. The trail seemed unfamiliar, like something had shifted. I stopped once and turned in circles, trying to match the landmarks, but everything looked wrong. The moss grew on the wrong side of the trees. The sun seemed off. I don't know how to explain it. After what felt like hours, I found the gravel road. I saw my car ahead, but something was wrong. The tires were slashed. All four. The hood was open. The battery was gone. There were scratches down the sides of the car, deep, long gouges that cut into the metal. I stood there, staring at it. I was alone, miles from help, and someone had done this while I was sleeping or maybe while I was on the trail. I felt sick. I went back to the cabin. I stayed inside for 2 more nights. I blocked the windows with furniture and kept the stove burning for warmth and light. I rationed my food. I barely moved. On the second night, I heard whispering. Not words, just soft, rhythmic sounds like someone trying to mimic speech. It came from the trees. I covered my ears and sat on the floor until it stopped. On the third morning, I ran. I didn't take anything except the hatchet. I picked a direction and ran through the woods, not following the trail, just trying to get away. I ran until my legs gave out, then crawled for a while. My arms were scratched, legs bleeding, face covered in sweat. But I didn't stop. Eventually, I stumbled onto another road. This one was paved. I followed it until a truck passed and slowed down. The driver didn't speak. He just let me climb in and took me to a gas station 10 miles away. From there, I got help. I didn't tell anyone the full story, just said I got lost and someone messed with my car. I didn't report the cabin or what I found. I didn't want to go back. I didn't want anyone asking questions. I checked the listing a month later. It was gone. The whole page was taken down. No trace of the cabin or the owner. I think about it sometimes, what I heard, what I saw, what I felt out there. It wasn't a ghost or monster. It was something real, something human, maybe, something that lives out there, away from everything, watching. I still have nightmares about that rabbit, that breathing, I haven't been to the woods since, not even a park trail. When I close my eyes, I still see those marks in the trees, still hear that soft tapping at the window. I know someone was out there, and I know they're still out there now.